All right, hello and welcome into another edition of 8Sports Nightcap. Back to regularly scheduled programming after a few weeks between the holidays and then VCU having a Tuesday game. Our schedule's gotten thrown all over the place with different reasons, technical difficulties, I think, last week as to why we couldn't have the show at the regular time. But no fear, we are back at our regular time, 6:45 on Tuesdays, as where we recap the weekend of sports and everything that happened last week and kind of look towards this weekend. And today's show is pretty simple, right? There's no hiding what's been going on across the country. We got NFL playoffs, we got college playoffs coming to a close, and then, of course, VCU basketball in action tonight against Rhode Island. We'll quickly recap that before that game tips at the top of the hour. In Rhode Island against the Rams. Both VCU and Rhode Island 14-4 on the season, so it should be a pretty good game. We'll get into that later, though, and we're going to start with the most recent, biggest news of the weekend, and that was Ohio State's championship last night against Notre Dame. They take down the Fighting Irish 34-23, and what started off as a not great championship. There's been a lot of those over the years. The championship games not as good as, the semifinal games or earlier games. And that looked to be the case last night, right, for a lot of this game between Ohio State and Notre Dame. Will Howard of Ohio State kind of led the charge behind Judkins, their running back, who had a couple of touchdowns, and it leads to Ohio State winning a national championship. I think what's interesting about this Ohio State team, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the stats, is a lot of it was homegrown. The majority of their team, from offensive to defensive line to linebackers, corners, other than Caleb Downs, were talent that Ohio State had, recruited on their own. But the biggest difference in this, of course, is the fact that their biggest playmakers were transfers, and Caleb Downs and Quinshon, is that correct? Yeah, Quinshon Judkins, and, of course, Will Howard. They were transfers in. So it's like you have all this talent, and they just needed one or two pieces to get them over, one of those being the most important pieces at quarterback. But they do get over that hump, and they win a national championship. And it ended up being a pretty good game in that second half. Notre Dame was able to really rally. They forced that fumble late to then make it a one-score game. Had that field goal that they probably I'm not sure why they went for that field goal, to be honest with you. But it leads to Ohio State claiming a college football playoff championship. What's interesting, they won that 2014 national championship. That was the first year of the four-team college football playoff. You fast forward 10 years later, 12-team college football playoff, Ohio State gets the first championship, their first championship under Ryan Day. And Ryan Day, of course, joins now, I think, just Dabo Swinney as active coaches with a national championship in college football. Now that Mac Brown is left, now that Nick Saban has left, now that Jim Harbaugh has left, it's just now Ryan Day and Dabo Swinney as active college football head coaches that have won a national championship. Ohio State actually outgained Notre Dame in this matchup, 445 yards to 308. They punted just once in this game, and that was late. That was the one punt that led Notre Dame to go down the field and make it an 8-point game. They had that costly fumble in the second half as well. It was a dominating performance. I think the score kind of shows it closer than what it really was. Notre Dame had a solid comeback. I think they can leave this game feeling like they competed at least in the second half. But that first half was, following that Riley Leonard opening drive score, there wasn't much to Notre Dame's offense at all. They couldn't stop Ohio State, who had talent all over the field. I said it on the show a couple of weeks ago. I thought that the matchup between Ohio State last round was probably the national championship game that was going to decide who got in and who out. Ohio State, Texas, that is, of course. Or even the game before that one, Ohio State versus Oregon, or earlier in the year. I thought that was that could have decided who won the national championship. Ohio State beat the best teams to get to this point. They are your national champions, and I think they deserve it. They looked great, and they claim a national championship. All right, let's turn our attention now to Sunday, because, man, how strange is it? How strange is it to call to say that the Washington Commanders are in the NFC Championship game? No one has been able to say that for over 3 decades. The last time that the Commanders, or Washington Redskins for that matter, made it to The NFC Championship game was in 1991, the same year that they, of course, last won a Super Bowl. They take down Detroit 45-31 in what was, a run-and-gun game, what ended up being a shootout. And, we talked about this last week as well, that if Washington found themselves in a situation of where it was going to be a grueling, 3 yards of dust game where, turnovers and good offensive line play was going to win it, I did not like Washington's odds in that whatsoever. And they put themselves in a situation of where it was a shootout, and they outshot the team that has been the more competitive offensive team all season. In Detroit, Jared Goff had a pretty solid game, and other than his turnovers, 300 yards passing, it's a score. But the pick six in this matchup, probably the big difference maker in this one. I think Jared Goff got kind of shaken up on that pick six as well. I'm still surprised they didn't call a targeting on that interception. He got rocked pretty hard trying to take the ball back. Jaden Daniels, though, probably has his best game as a Commander, nearly throws for 300 yards, doesn't turn the ball over, ran the ball really well. Brian Robinson was able to have some success running the ball. That's something we haven't seen Washington do in the second half of this season, is have any success in their run game. It's mainly been Jaden Daniels that has been their leading rusher for most of their playoff run and late season run. And now here they are, round 3 against the Philadelphia Eagles in what should be a pretty exciting game Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. I think a lot of people are pulling for the Detroit Lions to make that next step and get to the NFC Championship once more, and maybe make that next step after the type of season that they had to try to go to the Super Bowl. But instead, out of nowhere, it's the Washington Commanders that are headed to the NFC Championship game. And when you think back to when Dan Quinn was hired as the head coach of the Washington Commanders, I don't think anyone was that excited about it. I know I've said that before, but as the season progresses, I think it shows more and more that we don't know what we're talking about, right? As fans, no one has any idea of what the season's going to look like next year, and that goes from the college level to the pro level. No one was excited about Dan Quinn. I think everyone wanted Ben Johnson. There was Mike Vrabel getting called out there, Bill Belichick, all these different names, and then it was Dan Quinn, the same guy that took the Atlanta Falcons to the Super Bowl to have the most embarrassing loss in Super Bowl history, 31-3 to Tom Brady. It's that guy that has led the Washington Commanders, who were probably the worst team in football last year. I think they were worse than Chicago, who ended up, of course, getting that first overall pick. And they land probably the best quarterback prospect, the Heisman Trophy winner, Jaden Daniels. And he's had an incredible year. Not once has he looked like a rookie this entire second half of the season. He's been so impressive. And the emergence of De'Ami Brown at receiver has been incredible. This is a guy that at UNC, I'm sure if you're an ACC fan, you remember the name De'Ami Brown. He was great with Sam Howell back in the day in Chapel Hill. And he went to the NFL, and you kind of didn't hear about him for a couple of years. In fact, there were multiple years, 2 or 3 years, where De'Ami Brown didn't have a game where he caught the ball more than 4 times. And in this playoff run, he's been their leading receiver. He had 6 receptions for 98 yards, had that big deep pass reception that led to the Commanders having a score late in this game. And what made this game, I think, so interesting, it was that all the biggest names had the biggest impacts, right? Jahmyr Gibbs had an awesome game, 105 yards. Jaden Daniels had his best game as a Commander, as I mentioned. Terry McLaurin had a big touchdown catch. It was a great game, and the Commanders somehow are in the NFC Championship, and they have a matchup against a team that they've already beaten this year. Of course, the Eagles had left out a couple of, good players, essentially, in that matchup at the end of the season that Washington won. They did lose that really ugly game to the Eagles earlier this season, and so now I think the Commanders are way better than they were when they lost to Philadelphia earlier this year compared to the team they are today. But I also think that the Eagles are playing really good football. I mean, look at that game against L.A., yes, it was in the snow. You kind of have to take it for granted, this and that. It looked a little strange, was L.A. really prepared to play in the snow? But it was a close game, and they stuck it out, and they got the win. Saquon Barkley did Saquon Barkley things. And I think what's been so exciting about this playoffs is that the stars of the NFL have really shown out on the biggest stage. And that's something that we didn't really see. We don't really see in other sports, especially, the NBA recently. But every single big star has had massive, massive impacts on the playoffs this season. I mean, you think back to, as I just mentioned, Amon-Ra St. Brown had an awesome day receiving. Jaden Daniels has been incredible for the Commanders. Jalen Hurts has been solid. Saquon Barkley, their biggest star, has been good. Josh Allen, of course, went toe-to-toe with Lamar Jackson. We'll discuss that game in a second. But C.J. Stroud was good. Patrick Mahomes was good. I could keep naming these names all day, but I think what's interesting about this matchup, even the Chargers and their loss, Justin Herbert looked really good. And I think that's something of note is that the stars of the NFL have really shown out in this playoffs, and it's making this playoffs in particular feel like a really exciting playoffs. We have years past where it was Brady and Mahomes, and who was going to win, and there were bad games, but that's not been the case this year. But it's the Washington Commanders headed to the NFC Championship game, and they'll take on the Eagles Sunday at 3:00. I'm interested to see what the spread is, so let's find this out together. As sports gambling is legal in Virginia, so I don't mind looking up the spread here. Eagles, Washington line. And it's going to be harder to find than I was expecting. 2.5-point favorites, it looks like. That is against – this is not going well for me here. Let's go to CBS Sports, see what they have to say. Eagles -6. A touchdown favorite against the Washington Commanders. I don't know if I think they're going to win this game by a touchdown. I'm expecting a pretty close matchup. I think you do give the advantage to the Eagles since they will be playing in Philadelphia. But I'm expecting a great game. I'm really, really, really looking forward to this matchup. And it's almost as interesting as the other matchup, and that's the game between, of course, Buffalo and Kansas City, which will be taking place next week in the AFC Championship game. Let's kind of talk about how the Buffalo Bills got to this point. They survived their matchup against Baltimore 27-25 in the snow. It could have been a colder game. It was like around 30 degrees, so it wasn't true Buffalo as we've seen in the past. Of course, this game comes down to the infamous Mark Andrews drop on the 2-point conversion, which resulted, of course, in Buffalo being able to kneel out the clock and win in this matchup. But what a great playoff football game. And I know I've said that a couple of times during this show with all the different excitement. And when you look at this Ravens team, I think it's easy to kind of say, what do you change, right? They've had this awesome season. They have an MVP-type quarterback. They have the best running back in the NFL in Derrick Henry. They have some of the best receivers. That's probably the one room that they probably could look into improving is their receiver room. But it seemed like this was the year that Baltimore was going to take that next step and get to a Super Bowl. That's the one thing we haven't seen Lamar Jackson do, is get his team to that next level. And he got his team back to a spot where they could have tied this game up late. But Mark Andrews, of course, drops that 2-point conversion. In the previous possession, he fumbled the ball. In the previous possession before that, he dropped a pass. In the next play, Lamar Jackson fumbles. So I think there's easy to put a lot of blame on Mark Andrews. But one thing I loved about Lamar Jackson is that he owned it. Not once did he put any blame on Mark Andrews. He talked about his own fumble and, of course, his interception as well. Josh Allen left a little bit to be desired, I would say, especially because going into this game, I think everyone wanted to say that this game was going to decide who was the MVP of the season. And Josh Allen, despite getting the win, only throws for 127 yards. I will say that about this matchup is that Josh Allen left a little to be desired. But he played, Josh Allen football as well. He ran the ball, put his head down in the snow, and it gave us probably the game of the season on Sunday afternoon. But what a matchup that was, and what a matchup Buffalo, Kansas City is going to be. We've seen that, the past few years, but it should be a pretty good matchup. I'm going to give the Chiefs the advantage in this one. It's hard to count out Patrick Mahomes. I think that's kind of what we saw in that matchup against the Texans. On Saturday, it was a matchup where it's like you kind of expected Kansas City to win. It was a favorable matchup for them. They kind of got a little bit of help from the refs in a couple of spots, but Patrick Mahomes and Patrick Mahomes things. Is their team going to be able to do that against Buffalo? this weekend? I'm not sure, but it's going to lead to what should be a pretty great matchup. It's leaning towards looking like a repeat from 2 years ago, though, right, between Kansas City and Philadelphia. It'll be interesting to see if that's the case again, or how awesome would it be to see a rematch, right, between the Buffalo Bills and the Commanders facing off against one another in the Super Bowl. Who would have thought? Washington and Buffalo. That would be a Super Bowl I think everyone would be pretty excited about, but I don't think anyone would mind seeing kind of a rematch from a couple of years ago between Philadelphia and Kansas City. A lot of good memories from that game. Great weekend of playoff football. I mean, a lot of fun to watch throughout the weekend. But it's also basketball season, so we, of course, talk a little bit of basketball between VCU and Rhode Island. This game is live as we speak. Just tipped seconds ago. VCU enters this matchup on a 4-game winning streak. Rhode Island off to a 14-4 start this year. VCU off to a 14-4 start this year. Notably, Rhode Island's schedule is nowhere near as difficult as VCU's schedule is, and I think the net rankings show that. I think the KenPom shows that, and VCU 7.5-point favorites in this matchup against Rhode Island. I expect them to win this game by double digits, especially with how good they've been playing. Went on the road to St. Joseph's and got a multiple possession win against St. Louis. They beat them by 20 points, and they're rolling. I mean, they're playing like the team that I think a lot of people thought VCU would be this year. You know, they got those hiccups in the middle of the season where they dropped a couple of games they probably shouldn't have lost or could have won, especially those on the road on the West Coast. But now they're in a situation where they're playing their best ball. They're playing really good basketball at the right time of year. February is almost here. That's when you want to start playing good, especially as March approaches. And we get into college basketball talk. And with that March right around the corner, I think it's worth looking at Joe Lendardi's predictions. You know, he's been the guy that's been on the nose about this thing for years now. It's hard to disagree with a lot of what he said because he's been so right, especially over the past few years. At this point, it almost seems like the committee uses his his rating system to decide who gets in and who gets out. But right now, for the first time in a few weeks, VCU finds themselves on the Joe Lenardi list of teams on the bubble to get an NCAA tournament if they are not the automatic qualifiers out of the A-10. Right now, he has George Mason as the automatic qualifier, VCU on the next 4 out. So they're sitting right there on the cusp, you know, of these 10 teams fighting for those very, very few bubble spots. And this year, especially with, I don't know if it's NIL, or if it's transfers or what it is, but power conferences are dominating the pool this year. You're not going to see a lot of mid-majors at all, whether that's from the Big East, the A-10, the West Coast Conference. Not a good time to be a mid-major school, and I think those talks that, you know, Chris Mooney has had a couple of weeks ago, right, about expanding the playoffs. If it's another system of where it's nothing but Power 5 schools getting in, I wouldn't be surprised they maybe do expand that field a little bit. But with that said, VCU on the next 4 out. Big game tonight against Rhode Island. And I mentioned George Mason currently being the automatic qualifier for Joe Lenardi. And I think what is interesting about that, these two teams will face off in Richmond on February 22nd. It's one of the lone Saturday games for VCU at home this year. And that game, I think, is going to be insane. Looking forward to that. Might decide who's the regular season conference winner in the A-10. As for what's next for VCU after tonight, they will host St. Bonaventure, the Bonnies, another one of those teams that could be on the bubble if they continue to win games out of the A-10. At the start of the year, we thought that the A-10 might be a 3-bid league, and those teams looked like VCU, St. Bonaventure, and, of course, my apologies, either Rhode Island or Richmond. I'm struggling here. Let's look at the A-10 standings because I tried to do that off the top of my head there, and that was tough television, folks. That was we've had better moments on the show than that one. All right, let's pull up Browser and look at these A-10 rankings. So at the start of the year, we talked about this being maybe a 3-bid league. I want to get this train back on the tracks here, and that's not looking great. Dayton was one of those teams I think a lot of people expected to be a little better. They're at 12-6 this season. VCU at the top at 14-4. and George Mason, 14-5. They're looking like a team that could be, if they continue to have their season, VCU continues to have their season, and then there's a bid stealer like St. Bonaventure or Rhode Island at 14-4 or 15-4. You could see the A-10 maybe get 2 teams in if VCU continues to play like they have recently, especially if George Mason does. I mean, they kind of have come out of nowhere this season. And it'll be interesting to see that matchup between VCU and George Mason at the Siegel Center, February 22nd. Cannot wait for that matchup. That's going to be awesome to see. As for Richmond, they are struggling this year. No doubt about it. They lost Delaney Hunt. We've talked about that plenty of times on this show. They're off to a 7-12 start. They've lost their last 4, and I don't think it gets easier for them. They host a Davidson team that's red hot this Saturday, and then they go on the road to George Washington, who's also having a pretty good season in A-10 play. A lot of talented teams in the A-10, but they did not have a good non-conference, and that's going to really struggle for them trying to make a case for a multi-big league. But basketball season is here. College football is officially over. Ohio State are national champions, and I would be remiss not to talk about, of course, Travion Henderson, Hopewell's own, the former Blue Devil, played a major impact for the Ohio State Buckeyes this playoff run. Didn't have a massive night last night by any means, but was the lead feature back last night. Judkins got in, finished the job a couple of times. But big shout out to Travion Henderson. He claimed a national championship. The Hopewell guy was recruited by Ohio State, went to Ohio State, stayed at Ohio State. They asked him if it was okay to bring in Judkins. He said, let's do it. Let's win a national championship. And sure enough, Travion Henderson gets himself a ring, and he should hear his name called in the draft when his time comes, because he's been incredible all season for Ohio State. All right, but that's going to wrap things up here for another episode of 8Sports Nightcap. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. I just had a lot to go over between all the playoffs. It's an exciting time of year with college basketball really starting to ramp up, and of course the NFL playoffs are here, and how exciting is it that the Washington Commanders are good again, right, for the first time really in my life. So it's been exciting to see this team that's been around the area forever finally be good. And I had this conversation with a couple of friends of mine this week that it's like if Washington had been a better, more competitive team over the past few years, I think there'd be a lot more Commanders fans in the Central Virginia region. I'm sure a lot of teams kind of root for them, but to see the Commanders be good, it's a surprise, and it's a welcome one, I think, for sports fans around the area to see the area team doing well. And I think that's a good testament to I think how a lot of sports fans around the area feel, is that it's like, hey, this team that we kind of have a connection to is good for the first time in 3 decades. So I cannot wait to see the matchup this Sunday to see if the Commanders can find themselves in a Super Bowl. It's crazy to say that, but that's where we're at here, sitting on January 21st. But that's going to do it for another episode of 8Sports Nightcap. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week, Tuesday at 6:45, and busy week of sports. The Cavaliers are in action tonight against Boston College as well. I should mention Ron Sanchez trying to gain some momentum over there in Charlottesville. They've been in just about every game they've played in, but they just can't get over that hump and get a win. All right, we'll see you guys next week for another edition. Thanks so much for stopping by here on 8 Sports Nightcap on 8 News Live. Good night, everybody.